Hello, Count Sacke here, back with another Genshin Impact video. Today, I want to discuss a little bit about some theory crafting adventures that I've been going on over the past few days or so. And, well, yeah, not too long ago, I came across a YouTube channel called Kokumi Clan, and they came up with a very interesting way to, well, do theory crafting, and it involves using something called distributions. And well, I happen to, well, know just a bit or two about distributions. Granted, I will say that it's not nearly as highly leveled as, well, Kokomi Clan has planned in this video. Enemy AI, various other factors, and like gear. For me, I'm also just starting off as a theory crafter, so I doubt I could actually accurately determine these things. So yeah, this is something I found very interesting, and I decided that why not? I'll try it, but I'll do it with something that I know. But let me give you some background. So I'll head over to the Cutting Mains library, and here we have the damage formula. It's kind of long, but the thing I want to point your attention to is crit. There's this crit here, which basically is what people typically would assume when you have crit. 1 plus your crit damage percent, so whatever your value is in your crit damage, that is that. So this is if you crit, and this is if you don't crit. This is how we typically would actually calculate, if you want to just calculate something individually. But, well, the thing is, we don't always crit, so it's hard to say whether or not we should use this value or this value. Instead, what was shown here is that we have something called AverageCrit. And basically, if you ignore this whole clamp thing, it just makes sure your crit rate is between 0 and 100%. So we have this equation basically which says your average crit is equal to 1 plus your crit rate times your crit damage. But I find that very hard to believe. This is such a simple equation that, I don't know, it just feels off. It feels way too simple, way too whatever it is. It just doesn't, I don't know how you even came up with this equation. I mean, it kind of makes sense, but at the same time, it's like, can you really trust that? And well, here I want to show, I wanted to see if this is actually, if you can trust this equation. Can I trust this equation? And well, I proposed a very basic, simple experiment and theoretical situation in which I can test that. What I'm going to be considering is only a single character, just Yingguang by herself. So that makes things a lot more simple. If you're wondering what I'm going to be doing, well, I'll go ahead and show you what I want to do. So wait, when he gets up, that should be about right, there we go. 1, 2, and charge attack. That's literally it. So all I'm going to be doing is doing 2 normal attacks and 1 charge attack. That is literally all I'm going to be doing for this experiment to test whether or not I can trust the crit average, or the average crit, given by the people. Now, there are various assumptions that are made in this process, quite a lot of them actually. One of them, we're going to be fighting this Ruin Guard, which is a level 64 Ruin Guard. So another thing we're going to be considering. Notice here that Ningguang produces 2 gems. We're going to assume that those 2 gems from her normal attack will always hit. In fact, we're going to assume that all attacks will always hit. You also might notice, Yingguang can produces 2 Star Jades on her back. So if you can see here, on her back, she has 2 of these Star Jades. I'm going to assume that every single time, that is what she makes. Oh gosh. I have seen her make 3 at times, but to make things simple, we're going to only assume it's 2. So yeah, we're going to be we're basically going to assume that we're relatively close to the enemy. Like, at least close enough to where everything can lock onto the enemy. We're also going to assume that Yingguang's stats never change. Or the Ruin Guard's stats never change. Now notice here, because I don't really... I might have like the Widsith, but because I can't switch off of her, she will never get these buffs. I also should probably show all my stats because my calculations are based off of my character, based off my build and my character, which Could be better, but it's what it is. Then we have Constellation, C6. She's my main. For this one, the only thing, since we're only concerned with 2 normal attacks and 1 charge attack, we only need these first 3 talent percents. So yeah. With that, I believe that should be all of the assumptions. I mean, I guess I could say single target, but I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Yeah, I think it's pretty clear that I'm only doing a single target enemy. I'm trying to make things relatively simple for myself. Since I am only starting off as a theory crafter, I'm still quite far away from actually handling any more complicated systems. Let's head back, and here we are with the damage formula. And so, obviously, in order to actually do anything, we actually need to calculate the damage. And, well, we use this equation, and luckily for us, this equation actually it becomes really quite simplified. So yeah, this is the entire crit, the entire damage formula. If you're wondering, what I'm guessing what you're supposed to do is to take your average crit and substitute it into crit. Because what this should do is what this is supposed to do is to account for the fact that you don't crit all the time. And sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. But yeah, luckily for us, there are a lot of multipliers that are practically gone. For instance, proc, that's going to be 0, transformative reactions, 0, amplifying reactions. In this case, it's going to be 1 because we're multiplying it with everything, and if you multiply it by 0, you basically have 0 damage, which is not possible. Then we have damage reduction. We're not being nerfed, so I'm going to say that this is 0. And damage flat, if you actually read through some of the stuff like from sources such as this, you can actually check here. And, well, I found that practically nothing in here fits. And so we can go back to this equation. So this goes to 0. Then the special multiplier, again, this just becomes 1. It's only 1 because we don't want to get rid of this damage base. And, well, we're left with a relatively simple formula, which is that your damage becomes equal to the base damage. So damage base multiplied with the 1 plus the damage bonus, and you multiply that by your crit, and then this is multiplied by the enemy defense and enemy resistance. So I just decided to write it as the enemy multiplier. It's technically enemy multiplier resistance and enemy multiplier defense, at least in this equation, but I'm too lazy to write it out, so I'm just going to write it as M. And then this base damage, it's a very simple equation. It's this talent percent times the attack. The talent percents are basically the normal attack, charge attack, and the star jade damage percents given that I showed earlier. So that's pretty easy to deal with. And, well, yeah, this is the equation that we're going to be dealing with. Another thing that we should remember is that I'm going to be using both this average crit and the crit provided by this. I guess other things to note is that we need to account for the enemy defense multiplier. We don't have any defense reduction, and we don't ignore any defense. If we want to know the resistance of the enemy, we can find it in the enemy resistances database, which is pretty basic. So here we have Geo, and we have a Ruin Guard, so we just need to find the Ruin Guard. Ruin Guard, Geo, 10% 10%. Over here, you can see right there. And I've calculated out pretty much everything already. So here we have the no crit, which is 141. Then we have crit, which is 313. And, well, I also took the liberty to actually measure the actual values and compute the error. So these are very, very, very accurate, as you can see. It's like a 0.3% and 0.08 error. Then there's things like average crit, which I don't know what to compare it to because I can only crit or not crit. Alright, so then we have the charge attack, which happens to be these numbers. You can go ahead and read this all for yourself. And then next thing we have to do is to calculate the damage based on the number of gems. When Yingguang does a normal attack, she releases 2 gems. Then on her charged attack, she releases a single gem. And then after the single, and then she releases the star jades on her back. In this case, remember the assumptions that we said. We assume that everything is going to hit and that she will have 2 star jades Those are the main assumptions that we need to remember for these calculations. Next, we have the theoretical damage. We just take the number of gems and multiply it by the average crit. So again, we're using the average crit for this one. So this is supposedly the average damage. So we take this, multiply by the number of gems, we get this number. Do the same thing for normal attack because we're doing 2 normal attacks. Charge attack, it's this one times 1 because our charge attack only releases 1 gem. And then the star jades on our back, we assume 2, so multiply that by 2, we get this. And then summing all of this up, we get the average damage for this total thing, 2,957. So supposedly this is the average damage. But again, can I trust that? Because it seems way too good and simple to be true, at least for me. So, well, what do? We consider all possible combination of attacks and all possible chances where I could have crit. So here I marked out 3 events. One of the events is this, the number of normal attack crits. So because we release 2 gems, it's possible for 1 of them to crit, or 2 of them to crit, or none of them to crit. So we can see here, the 0 indicates that none of them crit. This 1 indicates that only 1 of them crit, and this 2 indicates that both the gems crit. So yeah, that's what these numbers all mean, and I just put them all out here, so it's pretty explicit as to what happens. And we also know the chance that I'm going to crit, which is 42.8%. And well, we can actually very easily map out all possible combinations of this pretty easily, and if you know how to do it, like if you've ever dealt with counting in binary, it should feel relatively similar to that, except we're not dealing with binary, we're actually dealing with like base 3, base 2, base 3, whatever, you get the point. So I've mapped out all possible combinations, which is you just start off with 1, then you add 1 to the next one, you start here, carry over to the next one, oh, we got to carry over to the next one, yeah, you get the point. And if you want to know, let's go for an example. In this case, let's choose this one here. So this one says that on the first normal attack, only 1 of the gems crit. Then on the second normal attack, both of the gems crit. On the charge attack, it didn't crit, and then the star jades, both of them crit. So that's what that says. And yeah, we basically mapped out all possible combinations, and this is the best possible combination where everything crits. So yeah. And then we have these things. These calculate the probabilities of the event listed here. So the probability that both normal attacks don't crit is this on the first one, and so on and so on. But how do we actually calculate that? Well, I use something called a binomial distribution. I know I can use this binomial distribution because we only care about the amount of damage and whether or not the thing crit. The damage doesn't depend on which gem crits. It depends on how many crit. Because of the independency of the gems, I can actually use this and so on. There are a lot of other assumptions that I can I can actually explain this in a bit more detail, but I don't want this video to be too long, so yeah. And maybe we can scroll down here. This is the probability that 1 of them crits, and the probability that both of them crit is the smallest. So yeah. Anyway, then we do this for every other column. We can still use the binomial distribution for both of these. It's very, 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 very simple to calculate these. And because all of these attacks are independent of each other, we can calculate them just by multiplying these probabilities together. It's quite simple. You can see here is the product of all of these guys, and we mapped it out for every single possible case. Then, next thing I did was calculate the damage that each scenario did. So it's pretty easy to calculate. Since none of them crit, we basically just say both gems didn't crit, and we calculate the damage based on if both gems didn't crit. It's very, very simple. It's not too hard. I think this one is actually easier. It is a lot more easier for most people to understand. So yeah, we have the total damage, and then we can just add these all up to calculate the total damage for a given sequence of how many crits happened. The next thing we had to do is to calculate or we actually don't need to calculate the probabilities, but we need to reorganize them into something that's a lot more readable. Because I'll be honest, for as cool as this looks, it's not exactly the easiest to read it. And if we if we actually take a moment to reorganize them, you might notice that some values actually appear more than once. So look right here, this one appears more than once. So that actually makes things a lot more awkward, and I decided to reorganize everything. Now, notice here that I have now the probability of getting a damage given a specific sequence of what crits and what doesn't. This dependency is very important. You have to keep that in mind. How much damage you do is dependent on what crits and what doesn't. That should be pretty obvious. So hence why it's not just the probability of damage. That's a very different case from the probability of damage given a specific case. And well, what I decided to do is reorganize everything from lowest to highest. If you're wondering exactly how I managed to reorganize this properly, it's not too difficult. I just need to select the area that needs to be reorganized. So if I wanted to reorganize this, I could select all of it. Then I could go to Data, then Sort, Range, Advanced Sorting Options, Data as header row. And we can see here we have our total damage, and we can sort it from A to Z. I basically did that here, so yeah. We use this unique function to basically pick out the unique values, so you will not find any duplicates in this set. And basically we just add up all the probabilities with the damage corresponding to this one. So earlier we saw that this 2591 appears 3 times. So basically, if I wanted to calculate the probability that I do this much this damage, I just need to add up these probabilities here. And well, yeah, once I've actually calculated all these probabilities, I can then go to the distribution. And well, I've rewritten everything, and well, yeah, you might be saying, how the heck do I calculate the average? It's certainly not the average of this. I will say right now, it's not like summing up everything and then dividing it by the number of possible cases. No, that only works if everything has the same probability of chance of happening, but that is not true. So how do we actually calculate the average? Well, it's actually pretty simple. You take the value, which is their damage, multiplied by the probability of getting that damage. Notice again that this is not just the probability of doing the damage, it's the probability of doing damage given this specific sequence. So again, keep that in mind, and we multiply them, and then we can sum these all up, and that gives us our expected value, which expected value is basically the same exact thing as average. It actually is. And it came out to be 2,954. Let's check back at our damage calculation for the average crit, or the average damage. 2,957. Very, 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 very close. That is actually pretty amazing. That's a pretty amazing approximation, if you ask me. Because that calculation is so simple that I would have never expected it to be so close. But we have to keep in mind something here. What is my probability that I actually do this expected damage? Let's take a look at our distribution. We can read here, so our expected damage is 2,954. 2,954. Well, I don't have a 2,954 because this is a discrete probability. I actually technically do not have this. It's actually technically impossible to get this damage. But let's assume that it's continuous and just let's pretend that it can be here. The chances of actually getting it should be between these two values, because well, we can see here there's 2,935 and then there's this 3,011. That's between this one. So we can kind of assume that it should be there, but turns out since it's closer to 2,935, I think it's pretty safe to assume that it's about 1%. The chances of supposedly getting this DP or this damage is 0. But if you want to pretend that you can get it, it should be about 1%. That's how unlikely that we would even get this damage. Here's the conclusion I can make, though. I can conclude that average damage using average crit is pretty accurate. It's very, very accurate, actually, and surprisingly so. The second question I want to bring up, which Kokomi Clan brings up, is how realistic is it? How realistic is it to assume that I would even do this damage? I guess I can also try to explain what this distribution even means. So basically, what's the probability that I do a specific amount of damage? That is what this thing is saying. But again, you have to be careful with what I'm saying here, because it's not the probability of doing a specific damage. It's the probability of doing a specific damage given what crits and what doesn't. So that's important that's a very, very, very important distinction. We can approximate this distribution if we wanted to, using something. If we want to draw it out, so I'll draw my vertical axis, which is basically the probability. If I can properly draw it correctly. So yeah, we have that. Then we have our horizontal axis, and then we have our data, which looks something like this. I would say it looks about like that. Actually, hold on a second, that's a little too high. I think that's a relatively close approximation of what the distribution looks like. You can see here that I'm more likely to get this lower end of damage, but that's actually pretty self-explanatory. I only have a 40% chance of critting, so of course I would expect it to be more likely that I do less damage than if I do higher amounts of damage. And, well, the average happened to be in a place that's kind of technically not possible, or in the point where there's less damage. This is why averages can sometimes be very misleading. In reality, sometimes we might have you could technically have a distribution that looks something like this. Like literally, or even if you want, we can think about things in terms of a Dirac delta function. You could have these two different values. The average would be literally between these two, but because these are discontinuous, these are exactly only single points like this, the average doesn't exist. You could calculate an average, but it wouldn't exist. In fact, because we have a discrete probability, it's actually pretty true that it's more like this case than it is this one. This one is continuous. This one is discrete. But what can I expect then? Well, I found a really interesting thing here. We can also write something out in terms of the cumulative probability distribution, which basically it says, given a specific damage, I add up all the probabilities of leading up to it. It's basically the probability of getting damage or lower, assuming this sequence, you get the point. You can see it right here. The probability of my damage given a specific sequence, the x, which we mentioned what x is the sequence. About 50% of the time, I will be doing 2,763 damage or less. But another 50% of the time, I'm going to do more than that with a maximum of about 4,307. So you might notice here that why is this one actually is closer to this part over here is relatively cramped. And then this whole part kind of extends outward quite far. What we can see here, we can actually see it right here, that there's a lower amount of variance, or it's a lower amount of variance in this data over here. And over here, there's a huge spread. And we can actually see, just by looking at that, this one looks more compact, this one is more spread out. And that's why when I draw this distribution, notice that it's kind of like one of them is kind of more, it's like slightly more, one of them is more thin, but the other one is more wide. So this one shows larger variance, this one shows less variance. And it's quite funny that we even have this little dip here, because I remember someone complaining that we can use that averages are fine, but whether, again, averages you can approximate the average, yeah, using average crit rate, but, well, this happened to be a case that literally came up in my mind as I read that comment, where an average could be incorrect. The point being, the average ended up being in a region that is actually unlikely, which is quite funny. But yeah, I've been rambling on for 40 minutes, a bit too long for what I would would have liked. In conclusion, yes, AverageCrit is a very good approximation of, well, calculating the average damage. But for my recommendations, I have to say this. Is it actually reasonable to assume that the average will occur? Or at least values around the average will occur? So yeah, I do want to actually maybe do a part 2 of this where I actually do an experiment and show my results of what actually seemed to happen the most and so on. So I want to verify my model, essentially. I want to verify that this distribution is relatively close. And, well, yeah. So if you want to see that video, feel free to subscribe. And if you like this video and you think it's interesting, I believe that you can go ahead and watch Kokomi Clan. They have very interesting videos. They bring up this whole idea of framework of model using distributions every now and then, and I find it very interesting, and I love it. And I have to really thank Kokomi Clan for basically even bringing this idea up, because it's so it just is so amazing that I could even think of doing this. So yeah, that's really about it for now. So thanks for watching and hope you've enjoyed.